Welcome to the Disability Sport Info Show, the podcast that explores academic knowledge about disability sport. My name is Dr Chris Brown, and I'm an academic with an expertise in disability sport. Each episode, I focus on a specific topic of disability sport and speak to academic experts to understand the area in more depth. So, join me and listen to the Disability Sport Info Show to get an expert view on disability sport. Hello listener, welcome to another episode of the Disability Sport Info Show. Today what we're going to be focusing on is technology and innovation in parasport. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Bryce Dyer, who is Associate Professor in Product Development within the Design and Engineering Department at Bournemouth University. So it's really great to have Bryce's expertise on the show. I think, Bryce, to start off, what role does technology and innovation have in Paralympic sport?
Primarily, the point of technology originally was to help facilitate or help a sport take place. So it might be, a wheelchair to provide mobility or a prosthetic limb to allow someone to walk or run. But to be honest with you, over the last 10, 20 years, that has started to change with some countries and some teams, where it's now become a basis for targeting performance and high levels of performance with that technology. So you're starting to get a fracture really from those who are just trying to engage with a sport and do a sport, and those who are trying to, what I would say, look for all the margins and excel at a sport. It's quite a dramatic shift in the last 10 years.
And in terms of that distinction, those maybe who are looking for the marginal gains, those kind of 1 or 2% that make a difference to performance, versus those who are just using technology to help facilitate activity and participation. How does it differ in terms of countries around the world? Is there a geographic split? Is it anything to do with wealth, heritage within the Paralympic Games? What kind of split between those distinctions are there for countries around the world?
The split varies almost in the same way as it would do with able-bodied sport. So it often is primarily to do with how successful a sport is in a given nation. How many medals do they win? How successful are the athletes? But the difference with disability sport is it can vary a lot by geography based on infrastructure, support, and what's actually available. So if you take, for example, we're obviously in Europe, we've got quite good supply chains to all the main manufacturers of equipment or assistive technologies, we call it, that would be used by such athletes. But if you're in a different country that's further away, more isolated, then even though you might have good athletes, they still might not be getting good results because the technology, the assistive tech they need to perform a sport may be substandard and then holding them back. So it's as much about sociological impact and economical impact as it is actually about raw athletic ability that you would normally see in able-bodied sport, for example.
Are there certain sports that are more prone to the use of assistive technology than others in a parasport context?
Again, it varies. I mean, the easiest way to look at that is really when someone listens to this podcast probably will be able to think of disability sport. There were certain sports that probably pop into their head. And often those ones that pop into the head are the more visible ones, and they're often those that are actually the better supported ones. So track athletics, track and field, for example, obviously very, very visible with a lot of the athletes we've had there. And they're arguably seeing the most development with the technology that those athletes are using. There are other sports that might be newer to the Paralympic Games programme or newer generally, or don't have very good infrastructure in any given country. The number of participants is quite low. They'll obviously not have as much development done and obviously not be doing quite so well yet. But that can change. It only takes a good athlete or a significant performance to suddenly highlight and showcase a whole sport. And then innovation can come quite rapidly along with that when that happens. Okay. And in terms of the uses of assistive technology or innovation, so off the top of my head, I've got an idea of a prosthesis for an amputee, a wheelchair racer. They're the kind of obvious ones that I think of, but what maybe are not as obvious to the listener, in terms of the use of technology? And you hinted at some of that just a minute ago. Yeah. Are you able to kind of provide some examples of how maybe when we don't even realize it, technology is playing a role in sport? As spectators, we're often focused on the big events, on the big days, but actually a lot of the technology that the athletes will be using will take place only as a training tool. It might be something that we as spectators never see. So, for example, it could be different types of prosthetic limb that allows them to do different kinds of activity, cross training, for example. They might be in the gym, they might be on the track. There's digital technologies, that biomechanical analysis, for example, motion capture analysis. A lot of this does cross over with able-bodied stuff. To be honest with you, it's less about the technology and more about the expertise that's wielding that technology, the tools that are available. to make sure that the athlete's properly supported and can do the best job they can do when it matters. And again, as I mentioned at the start, is where we have started to go through quite a significant transformation of disability sport from essentially just getting athletes with some form of impairment or disability to engage with the sport to now actually, in many cases, thinking, okay, this is just an athlete. The disability is almost irrelevant. These are the limitations that the athlete might have. So what can we do to get them from point A to point Z to the best possible performance that we can get? And for us in the UK, for me personally, that really started to change with London 2012, where we started to see some sports and some athletes really start to transcend their sport and enter social consciousness. So the average man or woman in the high street can name an athlete with a disability, whether it's an Ellie Simmons or whether it's an Oscar Pistorius or a Marcus Ream, whatever it is. There's athletes who have that ability to now transcend their sport, and that was unheard of 20 or 30 years ago. So again, major changes in both the way that we use technology, the way that the athlete is married to that technology and then excels using that technology.
Okay. How does it get designed and made? From a layperson's perspective, it's not like you can just go to a high street, as you say, and just go purchase one. What is the process that is involved? I mean, that may sound like a very simple question to the listener, but actually might be very complex as an expert in the field. But how does it get made?
My initial reaction was I laughed there. And the reason I laughed was because it is generally utter chaos for many of us that are in this field. What often typically happens is that, as you quite rightfully said, there's no off-the-shelf solutions here. Even two athletes with the same type of physical impairment will need to be handled and treated and supported completely differently from each other. It might be that the physical problems they get using technology has a time limit. So, for example, someone using a prosthetic limb might be great to run a 400, but by the time they run 5 or 6 heats of a 400 meter, or they might be doubling up in distance, doing 200 and 400 meter on the track, for example, they might get more damage than another athlete. So when you design such technology, you have to be really, really aware of the individual's constraints, abilities, needs. And they're quite hard to work with, because the great thing about athletes is that they know how to get the best out of themselves, but sometimes they can do it to quite significant levels of pain and self-torture to get there, because athletes have the ability to really take themselves beyond our perceived limits many times. But in terms of how it's actually designed, often these things for me have been thrown together because there's been a lack of expertise. I've had a cold call out of the blue. There might be someone saying, look, I really need help. I want to do this, that, and the other. It might be because they've got no support, there's little money, or they have got money and support in the form of a prosthetist or a medical practitioner. But the problems that a lot of practitioners or clinical practitioners lack is the ability to understand elite level sport, Paralympic Games sort of level sport. So they can design the technology, but they don't know how to really refine it. And as you said earlier, those marginal gains or those little jumps in performance, they don't know what they are. So when I've been involved in these projects in the past, I often end up being almost a sort of a mediator or a negotiator between the clinical practitioner and the athlete. And the three of us, those sort of three different types of people, me being product designer or engineer, the athlete on the other side, and the clinical sort of practitioner on the other bit, we all form essentially a holistic team of trying to get the right thing. But that will vary again based on the sport. So whether it's a prosthetic limb for a track and field athlete or a wheelchair for another type of athlete, a lot of this technology is designed very ad hoc. It's often modified, sometimes quite crudely. And for those that aren't aware, when you have an athlete go to a games like the Paralympics, there's a whole support crew there that are often gaffer taping and bolting together broken technology that the athletes physically destroy over the course of the 2-week program, such as the demands placed upon them. So it's really a whole life cycle here of developing the technology, maintaining that technology as the athlete uses it, and sometimes repairing it, because this stuff can be expensive and it might have to last a while. So sometimes you do have to literally gaffer tape, glue and bond stuff back together again. It just depends.
When do the athletes actually first start to utilize technology? Because when they're playing in a grassroots perspective, if they're a wheelchair user, they'll have their wheelchair, but it won't be obviously the same spec as what they would have at the Paralympics. That must be quite tricky for some of the athletes to adapt to in the first instance.
Yeah, and I think it also depends on what country you're in, because some of the national governing bodies are better, I think, at supporting athletes through the journey. In the UK, we've obviously got the lottery program, so we're better financed than most. And that does allow someone that shows potential at a reasonably young age to be appropriately supported right the way through their journey, possibly to Paralympic level for some time. If you take someone like a Jodie Cundy, who's done track cycling for, you're coming up for 15, 20 years in his case at Paralympic Games level, that's someone that's had good care. And he transitioned from swimming initially as well. So that's someone that's had good levels of support. But in other countries, and in fact, some of the projects I've probably done the most with, and the projects I'm working on now, that's a country that's got poor infrastructure, poor technological support, poor academic support, because a lot of the advances that are made aren't always by practitioners, it's by academics as well. And trying to get that information, that knowledge to the right people is often most of the battle, actually. And it's having the ability, podcasts like this, to exchange information and ideas around is absolutely critical now to getting the best out of athletes or people who just want to improve their ability to enjoy exercise and the well-being, that comes with that.
Thanks for the promotion of the podcast. Always appreciate it. So yeah, absolutely critical. Not my words, Bryce's. So you touched upon it there just a minute ago about finance, and we can't get away from the fact that it's probably not a level playing field, is it? So we've got nations, and this is a wider issue in the Paralympic Games anyway, but there is disparity between the richer nations and the poorer nations, and that obviously is across sport anyway. But do you think it's exacerbated in the Paralympic Games, where technology maybe plays a bigger role than perhaps in the Olympics, for the poorer nations who just don't have the finance to be able to compete?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer there is yes, you're absolutely right. Again, it isn't just about the cost of the technology, it's also about access to the information to support that technology, to help develop it, or the rest of it. Supply chain issues as well. But yeah, it's worse with, I would say, disability sport, because the nature of the products or the technology they use is so specialized, which means it's inherently, like a lot of medical devices, quite expensive. It can be broken relatively easily if it's a relatively inferior product, because sometimes people are just trying to undertake a sport or physical activity, and sometimes it can mean that the solutions are quite crude and not as durable as they possibly would be if it was a more broad-based consumer product that's made in their thousands, like a motor vehicle, for example, or a laptop computer. The level playing field is a real issue, and I have kind of two sides of the coin personally with. One is that I often develop the technology that's trying to push the rule margins. I openly concede that I'll often look at the rule books, I'll see where the opportunities are, and I'll try and help an athlete to exploit that legally, but to the very line that it can be taken. But then the other side of my interest is I'll often be working on working groups or in governing bodies to try and write the rules to stop people like me from doing exactly that. So I'm kind of conflicted with myself. The playing field has never been level in sport, and I think it's naive to assume that that's obtainable. But the idea here is to try and reduce the tilt, is how I explain it to people a little bit, because particularly in Paralympic sport, the difference between an athlete from a reasonably poorly supported country like, I don't know, for the sake of argument, Ghana, and then compared to someone like the UK that's got world-class lottery funding and a relatively large and blank checkbook sometimes with certain athletes in certain sports, that's really hard to rationalise. One of the lectures I often give to my students is a photo I've got that was taken, I think, back in 1996, and it shows the start line of a 100-metre sprint race for some athletes with amputations and limb absence. What was poignant about the photograph is that at one end of the photograph, you can see someone that's literally running with a peg leg. I mean, it's a very crude wooden or glass reinforced plastic based peg leg, essentially, right the way through to stuff that you might get from a local hospital that's got a degree of fiberglass there and rubber and more modern materials. And then over on the far right hand side, there's carbon fiber, and it's like the sort of cheetah leg style thing we're now very familiar with. And that's in one photo taken in 1996. There's no way that an athlete on the far left there can hope to compete with an athlete on the far right because of the technology they've got. And unlike other sports that we have, where the difference between the haves and have-nots is much narrower, particularly in able-bodied sport, with Paralympic sport, it is a real issue. And it nearly always comes down to cost or access to information and knowledge.
Yeah, really, really interesting points. And also, finance is finite for those countries investing in sport. And let's be realistic, Paralympic sport will get less money than Olympic sport. Yeah. So already, you're going to have less money to play with. Even in the UK, the Paralympics will have X amount of money, but it'd be less compared to the Olympics. And so if you extrapolate that to other nations where there's a smaller pot of money, then it's even harder for the Paralympic sports in those countries because they have even less money. And we know finance is really important, of course, for elite sports. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. But also the information and access to information. I think that's a really important point you made there too. I was reading an article on The Conversation talking about how some of the assistive technology are made, and they were talking about 3D printing.
Yes.
And how that is being increasingly used and also is a potential way to reduce that inequality gap. Yeah. What are your thoughts about 3D printing and its use in sport now?
it's becoming an increasingly affordable technology to the extent now that I've got sort of 18-year-old engineering students buying their own printers and having them in their bedrooms. You can buy a printer for, a couple of £100 sterling, right the way through to those at £100,000 and quite advanced. And we can print stuff in literally any material: carbon fiber, long and short strand, plastics, ceramics, and then more traditional sort of 3D printing polymers. So yes, it has come down in cost. The advantages are that you can make it bespoke. You can scan an athlete in, and a project I worked with at the last Games, we did exactly that, where we scanned in. I was doing a prosthetic limb for someone with an upper arm impairment, so they had an amputation just above the elbow. And we were doing a cycling prosthesis for them to ride their bike. So we scanned in their body, and then we could then design a prosthetic limb that would fit them exactly. And in that particular case, the athlete was a track cyclist who was competing in mainly in what we call the individual pursuit. So that's two riders on a track racing over 3 or 4 kilometers, trying to chase each other down as they go round and round for 16 laps. So we were able to design a prosthetic limb that was aerodynamically efficient and looked pretty cool. It looked so cool, it wasn't allowed to be used. It was pretty advanced looking and pretty funky. It does allow us to create prototypes considerably quicker. And I'll give you a practical example of this. When I first started doing these kind of projects back in, I think it was 2011 for the 2012 Games, that took us 3 or 4 months to do a prosthetic limb, to make it. It was made quite crudely. So the way that prosthetic limbs were typically made then was you'd make a shape of it out of what you'd see as foam. You then lay carbon fiber over the top, and that's pretty much it. That's after it's been fitted to the athlete. The socket that their limbs slot into is fitted to make sure it doesn't rub. So it takes quite a lot of skill on the behaviour of the prosthetist to get it to fit well, be comfortable, and look right. But if you get it wrong, you've essentially got to make the whole thing again and repeat the process again. But with 3D printing, a correction can take seconds. We can print something out overnight. I could hit spacebar or return key now. By the time I go into work tomorrow, there'd be something there waiting to go. We can then test that on the athlete, try it. If it works, we can then progress it back to the prosthetist to then do a final design out of carbon fibre that's all singing and all dancing. So yes, it has reduced the costs, but as anything, it's just a tool. And again, you need that expertise using it. 3D printing is the next big thing, but it is just a tool. It's just like a ruler, just a very expensive one.
Like you said, it is a tool. And as you mentioned earlier, you need to make it specific to that athlete, because an athlete's requirements are going to differ. So yes, the 3D printing obviously helps you to facilitate maybe quicker production.
Yeah.
And maybe easier production, but ultimately you've still got to take the time to make sure it fits that particular individual and their experiences.
Yeah, and that's actually critical with the sport in particular, because what you find is a lot of assistive technology at the moment is developed in a clinical setting, which is fine, but the way that an athlete behaves when they're at a race pace, for example, when they're in an event, or their actual physical behavior is very different in the event to what it is in a clinical setting. And something I learned very quickly is that often we develop technology or design technology, it would look great in the lab. And then as soon as the athlete uses it, they start getting discomfort or scarring or other ancillary problems because we weren't essentially testing them in situ the way they need to be tested. And again, one of the pieces of advice when I'm advising other people that are doing this, it's always to get information and knowledge from the athlete in the setting they're going to be training and racing under, and at the intensity they intend to use it at. And it's very difficult to simulate that in a clinical setting.
You hinted earlier, you have two hats, essentially. One to push the margins and one to keep the margins in place for performance. So again, a very big question to answer, but to what extent does technology aid an athlete's performance? Because listeners may be familiar with the case of Marcus Rem, the long jumper, who did try to get into the Rio 2016 Olympics. Now, his jumps would have potentially given an opportunity to medal in the Olympics. I think actually his best jump might have beaten Greg Rutherford's from memory, I think. Yeah. But there was a reluctance to include him because there was an argument that his prosthesis gave him too much of an unfair advantage. Yeah. Like it was too much of a skew towards technology rather than his physical abilities. And he was saying, well, if it's that good, why aren't other long jumpers in my field jumping the same kind of jumps as myself? And they weren't. So could you explain why that ruling was made? So why was it deemed that the technology was giving him too much advantage? And how do we stay within the acceptable boundaries between technology providing these fantastic spectacles or skew performance?
We'll deal with the functional bit first and the philosophical bit second. In terms of Rem's case, the critical thing with Rem was that he was launching essentially from his prosthetic limb. Now, people will say, well, that's wrong. I don't normally look at it that way. What I normally say is it's different. And it's the same as when we talk about things like Alan Oliveira in the past, the runner, or Oscar Pistorius. The way to look at these people is locomotively. The way they move and run is just inherently different to the way that someone who's able-bodied is. It's not always about do they have an advantage or not, because they actually have quite a few disadvantages as well. So, for example, a long jump is all about, arguably, in the distance, in the time that you have before you launch, you've got to get to be moving as quickly as you can. You need the highest peak velocity, essentially. Now, with a prosthetic limb, that is difficult because for a start, as soon as you start running, a prosthetic limb squashes downwards. It doesn't propel you forwards. It actually just squashes and you go nowhere. It's one of the reasons why someone like Oscar Pistorius, when he was still running, was notorious for having poor starts, because what would happen is he'd launch himself and he'd just squat and then he'd get moved forwards. So that's one of the disadvantages that Rem has got. Once he then gets up to speed, he's then got the problem that his left leg and his right leg aren't actually behaving the same way as each other, because they're both essentially different. One has a stiffness, so the way that we compress it. When things are stiff, if it's the same material, what should happen, arguably, is you can almost draw it's what we call Hooke's law. It's a graph whereby you add some force or a weight to something, it will compress in a straight line. It has a direct proportional effect. But our human bodies don't work logically that way. Our ankles and our knee joints create stiffness of the leg, and they don't necessarily do it at an even rate, and they don't necessarily all do it at the same time and in the same sequence. So someone who's a unilateral amputee, like Rem was, he again is at a disadvantage because he's got an imbalance there, leg to leg, as he's trying to sprint. However, when he gets to the takeoff board, he then chooses to launch from his prosthetic limb. That means, really, then rather than worrying about all that fatigue that he's generated between when he started running and when he launched, he's then using something that doesn't fatigue. He's then actually essentially launching from that prosthetic limb. And that was what most of the uproar was about. The argument being, why don't you just take off the other leg? Now, for reasons I don't know, and I wouldn't have been privy to, I don't know if Rem ever tried that to reduce the criticism he was getting, or why he didn't feel that was the right way to go. But the reality was he was taking off using his essentially man-made technology. And I think for most people in the governing bodies, that was just a step too far. But as I say, it isn't just because he was advantaged. I think that's a very naive or negative way to look at him. You've just got to essentially, when an athlete is trying to cross over from Paralympic to Olympic sport, they're essentially different, and that is very hard to regulate and measure. So that's the first bit. The philosophical bit is where it gets really muddy, because unfortunately, it doesn't matter how many guests you have on your show, you're never going to get the same answer to that question. No. It is incredibly subjective, it's incredibly emotive, and it's incredibly easy to upset a lot of people, because it's a very, as you all know better than I would do, disability can be a very personal thing. You're dealing with a lot of athletes that sometimes have gone through quite extreme levels of trauma or personal events to get to where they have. And when you're suddenly telling an athlete they can't do something at the end of it with all the hard work they put in, that isn't necessarily a great outcome for anyone, neither for the athlete nor for the sport as a whole. Knowing where these limits are, though, is important, because it kind of goes back to what you were saying at the start, in that cost, access, and safety are three pretty big cornerstones pieces of whether a technology should be seen as acceptable or not in a sport. And we always have to, within that sports governance area, have to remain vigilant of that, because if you don't respect those cornerstones, then essentially you'll lose control of the sport, and you end up with a sport where no one wants to compete anymore because they just don't feel they can compete. Cost is always the most obvious one, particularly with Paralympic sport, as you quite rightly pointed out. But access, as I say, and even safety, using technology that is effective but unsafe in the wrong hands, can cause a lot of problems. Whilst I quite openly say that there will never be a level playing field, it just doesn't exist. But we've got to try and keep that tilt to a reasonable level so that athletes are entering the sport, looking to progress through the sport and excel at the sport, and that it is as accessible as we can make it so they can get into it. And that's where the ethical debates take place of what is and isn't appropriate. That's where it gets fun.
You've navigated some tricky questions quite expertly and adroitly there. So well done for navigating that minefield. Now, for the uninitiated and potentially naive, so why was Oscar Pistorius enabled and allowed to compete at the Olympics in 2012, but Marcus Rem was not at the Rio Olympics? What was the key difference between his athletes? There is one obvious one, difference in the use of prosthesis, clearly. Different event. The point you made about Rem taking off with the use of his prosthesis is quite important. Now, a cynic, which I'm not necessarily saying I am, but would say that Pistorius was never going to medal in the 400 meters individually. His times weren't going to get him to the position where he was going to medal. Rem could have medalled at the Olympics.
Yeah.
Now, you can't say whether or not it made a definitive difference or not, but why, from a technological perspective, was Pistorius able to compete, but Rem was not?
It's a really good question, actually. I wish I thought of that one before. The key thing with Pistorius was that, for those that are listening to this and aren't familiar with Pistorius' case, he was essentially trying to cross over from the Paralympics to the Olympics. He then was told that he couldn't, so he commissioned some research for a start to try and prove that he didn't have a technological advantage. That's pretty key for a start. Rem didn't do that, or at least not to the same level. We're going back to 2008, 2009 now. It was very widely publicised. It was very much the forefront in the media about what was going on with this. It was a very high-profile case. So there was research that was conducted at the behest of the IAAF at the time, or World Athletics, I guess, as they are now, that commissioned a research to try and find out what the actual situation was. Because at that point, research was really scant. I started my PhD, my first PhD in this area, around a similar time. And, you know, your lit review, the journals you're trying to read about were very few in number because there just wasn't information out there. So the governing body and the athlete themselves both commissioned their own research to try and find out what was going on. Now, like a lot of research and a lot of scientists might be aware of, sometimes it's not what you do, but it's how you do it. And funnily enough, both parties managed to, advocate an answer that showed that the athlete either had an advantage or didn't have an advantage, depending on which side you wanted it to fall. What they worked out in Pistorius' case, though, was really that they got an agreement from him that he wouldn't use any prosthetics. They wanted him to use the same prosthetic limbs all of the time moving forwards. They wouldn't allow him to use any newer designs in the future. So they draw a line under it. And the other difference was that they conceded that he had disadvantages as well as advantages, as we were just talking about with Rem's case a moment ago. And I think, to be honest with you, it was an unworkable problem in that it was becoming very blurred in that were you trying to essentially outlaw a type of athlete or just outlaw the athlete, personally. And it was starting to become a bit like a witch hunt, I think, from the media's point of view, that they were targeting Pistorius. Whereas actually, in reality, from what I knew at the time, what they were more concerned with is they weren't actually really that worried about Pistorius. They were more probably concerned with what athlete would come next, because Pistorius inspired dozens of athletes to engage with sport with a disability, which is great. It's exactly what you want from a role model or a great athlete, to inspire the next generation. Sooner or later, someone was going to come along that was going to be faster, that was going to be competitive. And whilst Pistorius' times were erratic in the 400, it was highly possible that as an athlete would race longer and longer distances, if we take the marathon, for example, the actual disadvantages there are actually quite few, and you can really start to play on the mechanics of the prosthetics there, optimize them to such extent that I honestly believe that they would outperform an able-bodied athlete if the race was long enough and if the conditions were dry. Something else Pistorius had a problem was that he'd often slip out of his lane if it was damp because they had quite bad traction.
And would that be viewed as negative then? So if it's acceptable for an able-bodied athlete to outcompete a disabled athlete?
Yeah.
But then when we're flipping it, it suddenly becomes more problematic. Why is that the case?
I think the argument really here is that you need to evaluate each and every circumstance based on the context of each specific sport and type of athlete you're trying to take across to able-bodied sport, because irrespective whether you believe the research that Pistorius commissioned or that the IAAF commissioned, the reality that both of them agreed on was that the form of locomotion was different. Now, there is a philosophical question that says, well, isn't difference is what makes us all human, essentially, at the end of the day? That's where it starts getting really deep. But the problem was it was so different. You're almost comparing pedaling a bicycle with riding a motorbike, or, it was just completely different mechanically, so extremely different that it's hard to rationalize it. Now, in Rem's case, a few years later, the problem was inherently that he was taking off from his prosthetic leg. If he'd actually switched it over, he would have been allowed to, I think, to go to the games. Now, would he have been competitive? We'll never know how competitive he wouldn't have been. But had he at least done that, I think from his point of view, he would have been quite heavily penalised, because he would have had all the disadvantages of the run-up and none of the advantages of the takeoff. But I think from a sporting political point of view, and I think from an ethical point of view, in many cases, that would have been deemed acceptable. But he was quite, well, this is the leg I want to take off of. I mean, there's a condition we call laterality. And to explain that, if anyone is listening to this podcast, you will probably notice that when you walk upstairs, you always put the same leading leg forwards. Yeah, it might be you favour your left or your right. Now, what probably happened in Rem's case was, quite honestly, that the leg that he would choose to launch himself or go upstairs or launch from in the long jump probably was his favoured leg. The fact that it happened to be the one that his prosthetic was attached to was just coincidence. It's just one of those things. The fact that someone hasn't got that leg there doesn't mean that those the connections between mind and body somehow change. No, they don't. So quite honestly, it was just the way he wanted to take off. I don't honestly think he was trying to gain a technological advantage, but the problem is the optics of that from outside of the sport don't look great. And when I think a sport sees that the technology is being pushed that much, I think that's when they're going to clamp down, no matter how positive or optimistic the athlete is trying to be with their sport. And I think those difference in optics really is what separates the two cases. But the reality is, at the end of the day, we just knew so little back then, and it's taking time for science and clinical practice to keep up with the ethics and what happens in a sport. Often the technology comes out first, and then we all have to race as academics or as technologists to try and work out, one, if it's appropriate, and two, what is it even doing anyway?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you for providing those thoughts and more detail and expertise there. That was really, really insightful. Okay, so if we look to the next 5 years, so what, 2027, 28, so we would have incorporated 1 or maybe 2 Paralympics if we're including 2028.
Yeah.
What do you think will be the state of technology in Paralympics? So when we get to LA in 2028, how will performance be impacted by the use of technology?
Again, it will depend on the sport, but I think in some of the more major sports, I mean, we're still seeing times coming down in particular events quite quickly. So as the technology improves, prosthetic limbs is an obvious one in track athletics. I know some of the work I've done with track cycling as well. The times are coming down quite rapidly because when a technology is introduced into a sport, or when a sport is relatively new, bear in mind here, the Paralympic Games are still relatively young in their infancy in comparison to the Olympic Games. So you always see this rapid rise in performance, and then eventually it sort of tapers off a bit and plateaus. So with certain sports, as we progress, we're still going to see large chunks of times, I think, being carved in certain events, certain sporting disciplines as we move to the next games. Change in technology, as you mentioned, things like 3D printing, greater expertise in the knowledge base out there, better communications, things like conferences, podcasts, TV programs, multimedia. That's meaning now that people are getting access to information or exposure to role models that they probably wouldn't have got even as little as recently as 10 years ago. So again, that's going to indirectly improve performance. If I look back at the last, I've done equipment now for the last 3 or 4 games. The biggest change that I've seen in that time has really been dealing with the nations who aren't actually well supported, that are trying to get hold of knowledge and support they can't conventionally access. So it's not so much that the top end is improving, it's more so actually about the bottom end catching up with those that are already doing quite well. And I think that's something we'll see a change of as more athletes and more money essentially gets pulled into the sport.
Interesting. Okay. And let's end on a kind of positive and expert note, I think. What does gold standard use of technology and innovation in parasport look like? So what is the thing that you would recommend to all your students, recommend to any kind of Paralympic committee that wants you for your consultancy?
I would say it's not a gold standard technology, it's a gold standard experience. Okay. What I mean by that is it's essentially creating a form of technology that allows an athlete to engage initially with sport and physical activity so they enjoy it and can do more of it without fear of injury or discomfort or just being turned away from a sport because they can't do it. And then bringing them through that journey to allow them to then to excel and then succeed and then excel. So when you often look at TV and you see a carbon fiber prosthetic limb, that's actually the very end of that journey. Essentially, that athlete has been through significant experience of going through crude technology or developing technology to get them to that point. But it is a journey, holding hand in hand with technology from being very, very young. The crucial thing here is, irrespective of whatever guys like me design, it's really about enjoying your sport at the end of the day, getting involved with sport, getting the most from sport, enjoying the camaraderie, the positive experience that it brings. Because if you have all that in place and technology that we create supports that, then ultimately, irrespective of the end result, the athlete will be healthy, well, and will get the very best out of themselves probably at whatever environment that is, whether it's the Paralympic Games stadium or doing their local fun run, over 5 kilometers or whatever sort of thing. So it's the journey, not just the high technology destination. It's a gold standard experience.
Excellent. All right. It's been really interesting, really fascinating to chat to you about technology innovation. I mean, I know very little detailed insights about this area, just kind of the casual viewer perspective. So it's been really fantastic to get that insight and expertise. So thank you so much, Bryce, for taking the time to speak with me. I really do appreciate it.
You're very welcome. No, thanks for having me on.
No, you're welcome. Thank you. Well, I look forward to catching up with you soon.
That's it. That's all we have time for. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Disability Sport Info Show. Stay tuned for another episode. Until then, goodbye. You've been listening to the Disability Sport Info Show, academic insights into disability sport.